September 1961. The crisis had ended. João Goulart had taken office. The Constitution had held. The democracy had survived. Or so it seemed, because survival and stability are not the same thing. The forces that had tried to block Goulart had not changed their minds. They had changed their strategy. They were watching, calculating, waiting for the moment when the country would be ready to hear what they had to say. And Goulart, for his part, was not the kind of man who made it easy to be patient with him. João Goulart became president under conditions no president should accept. The parliamentary system imposed during the legality crisis had stripped him of the executive power the Constitution had originally granted him. In practice, this meant that every significant decision had to pass through a prime minister chosen by Congress. Goulart could propose. He could advocate. He could pressure. But he could not simply govern. For a man who had spent his career fighting for structural change in Brazil, that was an intolerable position, and he made no effort to hide it. In less than 2 years, Brazil went through 3 prime ministers. Each one struggled to govern, with a president who wanted full power, and a Congress that didn't trust what he would do with it. The system was designed to produce deadlock, and it delivered exactly that.
Something had to change.
Goulart was certain of it.
And he had a plan.
In January 1963, Goulart called a national referendum. The question was simple. Should Brazil continue with parliamentarism or return to a full presidential system? The answer was not close. Nearly 80% of Brazilians voted to restore full powers to the president. For Goulart, it was more than a victory. It was a mandate. The people had spoken. They wanted a president who could actually govern. Now he had to prove he knew what to do with that power. But more power also meant more pressure. His supporters expected reform. Real reform. The kind that had been promised. And deferred. And promised again. For years. His opponents expected him to fail. Or worse,
to succeed at something.
They were determined to prevent. The clock was running. And everyone was watching. By 1963, Brazil was a country that had changed enormously. And not nearly enough. The Kubitschek years had built highways, factories, and a capital. Cities had grown. Industry had expanded. A middle class had emerged. And at the same time, millions of rural workers still lived in conditions that had not changed in a generation. Land was concentrated in the hands of a few. Salaries were low. Education was scarce. The ladder of opportunity had very few rungs at the bottom. For the workers, the peasants, the unions, the student movements, the question was not whether Brazil needed reform. The question was why it hadn't happened yet. Across Brazil, labor unions had grown in size and confidence. The peasant leagues in the Northeast were organizing rural workers who had never had anyone speak for them. Student movements were mobilizing on campuses that had never seen politics, treated as something urgent. These groups didn't agree on everything, but they agreed on one thing. The Brazil they had inherited was not the Brazil they were willing to accept. Goulart called them the basic reforms, a package of structural changes meant to address the inequalities that decades of development had failed to touch. Land reform, redistribute and used land to the millions of landless peasants who worked it for others. Tax reform, make the wealthy pay what the law said they owed, and use the revenue for public services. Educational reform, in a country where illiteracy still kept millions of citizens from voting. Banking reform, reduce the power of private financial interests over the national economy. Voting reform, extend the right to vote to the illiterate, a change that would instantly double the size of the Brazilian electorate. For Goulart supporters, these were not radical proposals. They were overdue corrections. Common sense applied to a country that had protected privilege for too long. For his opponents, the language was different. Land reform meant confiscation. Tax reform meant punishment. Expanding the vote meant handing power to people who could be manipulated by demagogues. The same proposals. Two completely different countries. Reading them, and the distance between those two readings, was growing wider by the week.
It is impossible to understand
What was happening in Brazil in 1963 without understanding what was happening everywhere else. In 1959, Fidel Castro had taken Cuba. A revolution that began in the mountains had ended with a communist government. 90 miles from Florida, Washington had never recovered from the shock. And across Latin America, the question that every powerful institution asked, the military, the church, the business class, the American embassy, was the same question. Who is next? In Washington, the CIA was watching Brazil closely. American companies with investments in the country were lobbying the State Department. Cables were sent. Reports were filed. Meetings were held. The conclusion, drawn long before anyone had definitive evidence, was that Goulart was a problem. Not because he had declared himself a communist. He never did, but because his reforms threatened the kind of Brazil that American interests preferred. And in the Cold War, that was enough. Inside Brazil, the same fear was being cultivated with care. Newspapers funded by conservative interests ran daily warnings about communist infiltration. Church groups organized against the Red Threat. Business associations printed pamphlets. Military officers gave speeches. Goulart had never advocated a communist revolution. He said so repeatedly. But in a polarized environment, what you say matters less than what your enemies are able to make people believe. And his enemies were very good at making people afraid. By 1963, the argument had outgrown the institutions. It was in the streets. Labor unions organized strikes and marches. The peasant leagues held demonstrations. In cities that had never seen rural workers arrive in organized columns, student groups mobilized on campuses and spilled into the streets around them. And on the other side, conservative groups organized their own marches. Business associations. The family was under threat. Middle-class neighborhoods, where fear of the left had become the organizing principle of daily life. Everyone in the streets, everyone certain they were right, everyone convinced the other side, was marching toward catastrophe. Inside the institutions, the same fractures were appearing. In Congress, alliances collapsed and reformed, week by week. In the press, editors chose sides and stopped pretending otherwise. In the military, officers who had always disagreed politically now disagreed about something more fundamental. What were the armed forces for? To serve the elected government or to protect the country? From the elected government? That question had no safe answer, but everyone was being forced to choose. On March 13, 1964, João Goulart held what would become one of the most consequential political rallies in Brazilian history at the Central do Brasil railway station in Rio de Janeiro. The crowd was enormous. Estimates ranged from 150,000 to 300,000 people. It was the largest political gathering Brazil had seen in years, and Goulart used it. From the stage, Goulart signed 2 executive decrees. One nationalized private oil refineries. The other announced the beginning of land reform, the expropriation of large and used estates along federal highways and railways. He signed them on stage, in front of the crowd, under the floodlights, and then he gave a speech that left no room for ambiguity. He called on Congress to approve the full basic reforms. He attacked his opponents directly. He called the Brazilian Constitution inadequate for the needs of the people. For his supporters in that crowd, it was the speech they had been waiting for. Finally, action. Finally, courage. Finally, a president who meant what he said. For the military officers watching on television, for the conservative politicians listening on the radio, for Washington reading the cables the next morning, it was something else entirely. It was the moment they had been waiting for too. After March 13th, the temperature did not come down. It kept rising. 11 days later, the conservative response arrived. The March of the Family with God for Freedom brought hundreds of thousands of people into the streets of Sao Paulo and then other cities, a counter-demonstration of scale that matched what Goulart had assembled at Central do Brasil. Two Brazils, two enormous crowds, two completely incompatible visions of what their country was and what it should become. Inside the barracks, conversations that had been whispered for months were now spoken openly. The officers who had wanted to block Goulart in 1961 had never stopped wanting it. They had simply waited for the political conditions to be right. After the rally at Central do Brasil, they believed those conditions had arrived. The newspapers that had always opposed Goulart began using a new word: not reform, not crisis, revolution. And when opponents of an elected government start using that word, history teaches us what usually comes next. João Goulart believed he was fighting for a fairer Brazil. His supporters believed it too. Hundreds of thousands of them had stood under the floodlights at Central do Brasil and felt the weight of that belief. But belief in politics is never enough on its own. You also need the institutions to hold. You need the opposition to accept that losing an argument is not the same as losing everything. You need the military to remain what a military in a democracy is supposed to be: the servant of the civilian government, not its judge. None of those conditions existed in Brazil in March 1964, and the people who were about to act knew it. Next episode: the final days, the marches, the last miscalculations, and the night of March 31st, 1964, when the tanks began to move.